What's up, everybody? Welcome to Podcast Now. I'm Alex, and in this video, I want to go over 5 tips for Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth's combat, and this is for beginners. So much like we did for just the general games tips, right? This is if it's your first game in the franchise, or maybe you're a little rusty on it. This is not expert things, and honestly, I'm not far enough in the base game to give, expert advice. I'm sure there's a lot more to the combat when you're 30, 40, 50 hours in than when you're just a few. But I tried to, again, if you're just jumping in, try to give you guys a few tips for what to expect. So let's start with, again, much like a blanket statement, but I think it is very, very important. So grinding, the importance of grinding. Look, we talked about this, in past videos. Reviews made it sound like you don't have to grind, okay? Now, maybe it was like an overcorrection because in the last game, you had to grind like crazy. It was a requirement, all right? There was a specific part in the game where you probably had to level yourself up naturally from where you were to where you needed to be. 10 to 15 levels. Between one mission and the next, you had to level up maybe 10 to 15 levels. That specifically is not in this game, okay? So that's definitely been fixed. However, grinding is still kind of necessary. There are times, especially if you're like me. For me, I tend to put the story, even though the story's, pretty darn good, I normally do a lot of the side stuff first and kind of get it out of the way. And then I just kind of like rapid fire, story mission after story mission. And why I'm saying this is, okay, well, if you just do the side stuff, you're going to be running around multiple parts of Hawaii. And you're going to be looking, in the bottom left, seeing that whole, not really star rating, but seeing a rating system. And you're going to be running up against some pretty strong enemies. If you go in the wrong corner of town, you can face some strong enemies. So you need to be ready for that. And obviously, well, grinding, simple enough, right? Just facing enemy wave after enemy wave after enemy wave. What I did personally was I focused on 1 to 2 dotted areas, like star ratings, right? So I try to focus on enemies maybe like levels 8 to 10 or 12, okay? And I just fought over and over and over and over again. Side missions, sometimes you'll fight and that gives you XP, but what I found most helpful is you want to normally at least match the enemy's level. If you're fighting enemies that are 2 levels, maybe higher, that's probably the max. To be honest with you, I wouldn't try going after enemies that are more than 1 to 2 levels higher. If you run into an enemy that's 5, 6 levels higher than you, especially if there's like 6 of them and there's like 2 or 3 of you, escaping is the right move, okay? But, how you get to that level, just by fighting wave after wave after wave. And again, what I would try to do is, if I had like a full squad, or, if our health and our, ability kind of points were okay, I would face bigger groups of enemies. If it was a little bit weaker, I'd face smaller ones. And another kind of tip with grinding, the ones that have like the crown on them, there's people that'll have crowns that are kind of guarding specific areas. You do have to be careful because some of them can be extremely powerful, okay? Like very much higher level than you. But if you're only in the lower starred areas, right, where enemies are generally weaker, you can probably take them. Again, you don't want to go more than like 1 to 2 levels higher than you, but that is a quick way of getting XP. Those crowned enemies, they give a lot of XP. You'll level up pretty darn quickly, okay? So grinding, is it necessary? Not as much as the last game, but I do think you need to grind. I do think you should always maintain at least the same level as your opponent. If not, you should be a couple levels higher. Okay, so now going into the specific one, a tip that I want to talk about, or a strategy, let's say. I want to talk about Kiryu specifically. So he's not in it, in the beginning, but, you go in just a few hours into the game, he becomes a permanent, spot on your team. And he's a really interesting character. So he's got, I'm just going to say, left, top, and right abilities, okay? And these are his fighting styles. Now, you need to kind of know, I would say, when to use them. So what I do personally, I do use him as a tank quite often, which is his right one, okay, his right fighting style. And this deals a lot of damage. This will guard break enemies, which a lot of enemies actually in this game need their guard to be broken, all right? So he's your go-to guy for that. I actually find it quite useful. And then he's almost like a bullet sponge, right? Like he'll take a lot of damage, against him. So what I primarily use him for, like I said, at least in most fights, is the tank. is a guard breaker. But one kind of, I would say, literal tip that I have found with him, his left ability, okay, it's the red one, right? He's faster, he's more nimble. And what I use this for is taking out multiple enemies. Now, we're going to talk about later in this video, grouping enemies together, trying to, get your abilities to work in the best way. But if they're spread out, this is actually the best way of dealing with more than one. So what I use Kiryu for with his left attack, okay, is if there's two enemies that are close to death. If there's two enemies that have very low health, he does two attacks with that fighting style. So if two of them are laying on the ground, he goes over the one, he takes one out. Even if the other one stands up, he's able to do a second attack, and I use that. I think that's extremely useful. So while, the right one is more of like a tanky kind of response, the left one is, hey, if you got two enemies that you want to take out, and you do, right? You normally, what I do is I try to finish enemies off, because if they're gone, they don't pose a threat to you attacking you. They're not there anymore to attack. So if you have the opportunity to take two enemies out versus one, I always take the option of two, right? Because that's just two less enemies that can deal damage to you. And that's where that attack, is best. His top attack is more of like the standard one. That's where if it's an environmental thing, he'll maybe slam them, against like a window, or he'll pick up a bike and hit them. I'll be honest, I really don't use it that often, because I kind of use Ichiban as that kind of role. But Kiryu, again, I tend to do left and right. Third thing I want to talk about, and this is super quick and super easy, so we'll kind of just get out of the way, doing your perfect blocks, okay? It is something, I actually don't remember if the game even tells you to do it in the beginning, but it was a really big feature in the last game, and it was kind of promoted that you needed to do it. I don't remember the game telling me, to do these like perfect blocks, but they are in this game. So whenever possible, block at the exact moment that the item or the person ever hits you, right? It'll just deal less damage to you. It's hard. I got to be honest. Like I think I succeed at doing it maybe like 60 to 70% of the time. It kind of depends on the enemy. Some enemies' attacks are just so hard to predict that I tend to mess it up. And for that, you kind of just have to get used to it, right? There are a lot of enemy, variations, and I like that. There's a lot of different enemies in this game, but you will fight them, over and over. So you kind of get used to what they do. So if they're swinging, right, you kind of get into a groove of when their, weapon hits your body, and you want to just block, at that right time. So it is very useful. It prevents you, from being knocked down. That's important. It obviously, lowers the amount of hits it's going to do against you. It's definitely something you should do literally every time. You're not going to nail it every time, but at least try. Okay, number 4 is grouping. I want to talk about grouping. This is maybe like the most important thing to do in this game. Now, it is sometimes at the will of the game. The enemies move just kind of randomly. Now, sometimes they almost have a pattern, like a path, right? Like an AI pathing. Sometimes they'll come back, but sometimes enemies just move in really weird ways where you can't get them all together. So I guess what this tip is almost waiting them out, right? If you see a good opportunity to do a group attack, so Ichiban is actually a really good example of this, right? His like, I think it's called Grand Liner, right? It's a straight line. And there's a couple of different abilities for different characters where it's either straight lines or circles. So, is there ways of getting them next to each other? Well, yeah, sometimes going up to them and seeing where that arrow, is going to point. Maybe you have a different, ally, like Kiryu, say, hit them into an area of other people, right? And this is why you do it. This is why you do grouping, because if they're all close to each other, you can do abilities on multiple people. That's very important. And then also, you can use them to hit each other. So if you run up to one, right, and you aim that arrow just right. Now, there's actually 3 different things to this. Number 1, using the arrow to hit one enemy into another. Very powerful. Not only does it hurt both of them, but they both will end up on the ground. So that is huge, because that is, as long as you're a pretty good level, even if you match them in level, you might be able to take them out, in the next move. So hitting one into the next, very important. Back attacks, going around them and trying to hit them. Now, I hit plenty of enemies in the back, and it doesn't give me that bonus. Again, that's kind of the game. The game's either going to give it to you or it's not going to give it to you. And then finally, hitting enemies into your own ally. So if you do this right, and again, the arrow has to be pointed just right, actually annoyingly right, but if you do this, especially even if you do a back attack in combination with it, You can hit an enemy into your ally. They'll do massive amounts of damage on top of what you already do. So those are kind of like literal fighting techniques, but grouping them up is a good idea just in general because it can kind of lead to that stuff, right? If they're too far apart, you're not going to have them be able to hit each other. So again, you're going to have to kind of wait them out. They will tend, especially if there's like 3, 4, 5 of them, they will tend to kind of group up naturally. And that's your moment. Again, it's either use an ability or hit one into each other. That's the best way, I think, of just winning fights generally. But also being able to eliminate multiple enemies at once. You know, like I mentioned with Kiryu, anytime that you have to take out 2 enemies instead of 1 enemy, I risk it. I always risk it because it's just less enemies that'll hit you, on their turn. And then the 5th and final thing, and this is kind of a combination or an add-on to what we just talked about, is using the things around you. This is extremely important. And while the game gives you, if you go around just like the world, you can pick up grenades, you can pick up all sorts of stuff. I honestly have not used one item at all. I haven't used pound mates at all. Now, I'm sure I will. I absolutely, I'm sure I will. I haven't actually even used buffing or debuffing. Ichiban can actually, raise attacks. There's characters, later on that will lower attacks of enemies. So far, I haven't used it. I used it a ton in 7, so I'm sure I will use it now. But part of the reason, why am I saying that? Part of the reason why I haven't used items yet, part of the reason why I haven't even used certain abilities, maybe half of some of these characters' abilities, is I don't need to. Why do I not need to? Because the weapons on the floor, the weapons around you, are so much easier to use now than they were in the last game. The last game, you had to get lucky. You had to assume when you're running up, if you run past a bike, that the AI will pick up that bike and use it to hit. And most times they would not do that. And that deals a lot of damage, but the game would just not give that to you. This time, oh my God, it's so much better, right? So you have movement. You can move around a little bit, and that's important because you're going to want to position yourself, moving yourself to an item. Now, actually, as the characters level up, I actually did this with Kiryu and I think one other character, the higher their level, eventually, like a perk of it, is their movement radius is increased, okay? So as you level them up, they'll be able to move even further than they already did. That's great because if there's a bike around you or if there's a cone around, whatever it is, because most times, like I said earlier, it's actually going to end up with the enemy on the ground. Even if the weapon doesn't, fully take them out, you want as much as possible to get them on the ground so that another character can pretty much, like I said before, almost one-hit them after that. So so far, me playing it, it happens all the time. There are so many environmental items, let's say, to use that it's actually kind of insane. A lot of office material, even things just on the street. There's a lot. I never think, I never pass up an opportunity to use this stuff. Really, even if it's characters that I know are strong and might be able to just do the damage anyway, I always use the environment. I mean, I think statistically, it literally does more damage, okay? But again, it'll end up on the ground. Many times, actually, I mentioned grouping the characters up or the enemies up. I got lucky a few times, and I picked up a bike like with Ichiban, and I think I hit 3 enemies at the same time, even though I was only targeting 1. Because they were so close to each other, the game just gave it to me. And that would not have happened, if I used his bat. If you use his bat, maybe 1 enemy will hit the next enemy, but it won't hit 3, it might hit 2. If you use a bike, which is like a bigger radius, a hit radius, and the enemies are already close together, and I did it. I knocked out 3 enemies in one go using a bike. So I think it's so much improved. I think it's so much easier. I think that's part of the reason why I haven't had to use a lot of these, other things that I did use a ton in the last game. I haven't really needed to, because instead of relying on AI to pick up a cone, now you can directly do it, right? And it's as easy as simply like looking for that hand grasping icon. You just wait for that, click it, and then they'll pick it up automatically. You just got to be, close to the item. It's hard. Sometimes characters won't be around it, and you can't really move a character, closer to it. You kind of have to wait for the AI to naturally move themselves. That can be annoying, but overall, it's much improved. So let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, bell icon turned on, and I hope to see you all on the next one.